So this is a conversation with Zoe Smith. She's a London-based writer with connection to the Caribbean, and she had written two pieces for The Correspondent, which I wanted to talk to her about. The first one is called The Unthinkable Has Become Reality, How Can We Build Back Better? And the second one is called Mutual Aid is Sweeping the World, Here's How to Make This Anarchist Way of Organizing Last. So how do we make mutual aid last? Using the examples of Barrios de Pie in Argentina, or the mutual aid groups popping up in the UK and beyond, we try to answer that question. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at FridayStimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon or buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
So I'm Zoe Smith. I am a London-based writer with connections to the Caribbean, but yeah, London's where I'm based.
Awesome. So we'll focus on two pieces that you've written for The Correspondent.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is called The Unthinkable Has Become Reality, How Can We Build Back Better? And which was published in May. And then the second one is called Mutual Aid is Sweeping the World, Here's How We Can Make This Anarchist Way of Organizing Last, which was published some weeks ago. So can we start with you telling us a bit about these two articles? How did they come about and what are their main arguments, let's say?
Good question. So the series came about when I saw that the Correspondent was looking for people for experts to talk on issues to how people were reacting to the coronavirus pandemic. This probably was sometime in March, late March. And one of the issues that I suggested that they could look at was how the issue of access to cash was actually proving to be quite problematic for the unbanked. I think that I sort of felt that there was definitely a very Western lens being applied to the problems and the solutions. And actually in like non-Western environments, there were people who were having significant issues just because our lens wasn't really focused on realities other than our own. And they were saying, great, why don't you talk about it? And I was like, I know nothing about the banking system at all, so I'm definitely not the person you're looking for. But I'd written for them once before, and then that conversation led to a chat with their editor, just really with me expressing my frustrations at early on in the coverage of the pandemic. It was a lot about sort of hoarding, people being irresponsible and not wearing masks. It just felt very, very negative. And it was just massively getting me down and didn't feel at all sustainable to me as a way of sharing information with people at a time that what we really needed were solutions rather than criticism. And I think just for me, how I work as a person is just trying to sort of map a way out. And yeah, as I was kind of doing that research anyway, I was talking to the editor and I said, well, if you're interested, I'm looking into this stuff. I'll be more than open to writing a series of articles looking at the way in which people are responding. But one of the things that I was quite clear on is that my interests don't lie at all at the state or big systems level. What fascinates me is how change is made like at the street level or community level or family level. So yeah, looking at solutions at a lower scale was what I found interesting. So yeah, that's basically how it started, and I think that's what I spoke on in my first article, but it was such a long while ago I can't remember. But yeah, I think that was probably what I was trying to do.
So the example, I think the example that you focus on is on Barrios de Pie in Argentina. Can we talk about this for those who don't know? Like, just what is it about? Is it and at the same time, like, if we can also maybe nuance it a bit and perhaps explain a bit for those who don't know, like what's the difference between what these folks have been trying to do and, let's say, like a charity, let's say.
Yeah, and I realized in preparation for this article that you're actually like half Argentinian and Italian, so maybe you should lead this conversation rather than me.
I wish, but unfortunately, and like to my shame, I would say I discovered about them by reading your piece. So
Oh, no way.
I'll leave the floor. Yeah, I'll leave the floor to you.
Interesting. So yeah, that piece started out as an exploration into the concept of mutual aid, which was a term that had been cropping up quite a lot
Yes.
around sort of late March, April time. And I was just curious as to its origins, and the work by Peter Kropotkin, Mutual Aid, came to light. And I just started basically just doing some research into the origins of the term. And in a roundabout way, that led me to the interesting example of the MTD movement in Argentina. And I think what I was trying to do was to move the conversation on from mutual aid is occurring to what are some examples of where mutual aid at a bigger scale, or kind of more participatory forms of democracy, how can it be sustained? And the example of initiatives that were taking place in Argentina, that was, I basically use that as a vehicle to explore how that sort of popular movement can be sustained over time. But I think the initial example that struck me as just being fascinating was the concept of worker-led companies. So
Yes.
after the financial crisis, the idea that companies went into administration, but rather than employees being turfed out onto the street, they actually took over the running of the companies and were still able to fulfill orders. And I just found that it completely flipped many concepts that I had in my head on its head, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just thought that an environment where that sort of thing was happening, as well as nurseries run by communities to libraries libraries and universities aimed at just helping ordinary people in ways that functioned indirectly of the state. It seemed quite amazing. And then had a stroke of luck to connect with an author, Marina Citron, who had actually spent a good few years in Buenos Aires in 2001, 2002, just at the time where things were just really getting a lot of attention. And yeah, she spoke to me about her time there and what she learned, and also the relevance for now, which was quite interesting.
It is very important. So I did this episode about a month ago, I think, on mutual aid in Lebanon, and it's still very small. In most cases, well, in pretty much all cases, really, it is done without being called that. It's more like this instinctual thing of people coming together, essentially, and understanding that, well, we need to figure this thing out together because there's no other way, really. And
Yeah.
what I really liked, one of the things I really liked about your piece is how you also highlighted the fact that well, like mutual aid shouldn't be romanticized either. It's not necessarily that as soon as someone or a group of people say that, okay, we're going to try this out, it doesn't mean that they will necessarily succeed. It doesn't mean that they will necessarily it doesn't mean that they won't come upon a number of obstacles, let's say.
Right.
And there are real challenges at multiple levels. We're seeing it down in Lebanon. I know that in the UK, we've seen quite a lot of these initiatives popping up. Some of them may not last, some of them will last. And so it'll be very interesting to see where those that who haven't lasted, like what have they quote unquote done wrong, or what can we learn from them? Because some of the best example, or maybe it's not the best, I mean, one of the most well-known examples, I suppose, in the past decade or so, a bit earlier, was the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the U.S.
Yeah.
And the story that I remember, it was for me, it was one of those moments of, I thought, we're just going to see like kind of like a dog eat dog situation, like every person for himself or herself or whatever. And it's not actually what we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. We saw quite a lot of these groups coming together. Mutual aid groups were actually some of the most effective groups, to the point that, from what I remember, some charities were actually diverting their resources away towards mutual aid groups because they were just much faster at doing things. I wanted to ask you, like, if we can, in your piece, I think it was in the second one, you move from mutual aid, or it's, I guess it's part of it, but like what's called horizontalism. Sorry, I can't pronounce it.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that process?
Yeah. So horizontalism is a phrase directly translated from Spanish by Marina Citron. So I'm not sure if it fully conveys what she meant when she first used it, but it's basically if I'm not butchering her concept, but it's basically a decentralized way of decision making.
Yeah.
So rather than doing things in a top-down way, it's just about everyone having access to share views, to debate through concepts in a way that really takes into everyone's point of view. So it's kind of a way of just reestablishing community. And I think you raise a really good point, is that there is this this tendency to, now that the mutual aid trend is here, everything has to be labeled mutual aid. And then once it's labeled as mutual aid, the question is, how do we scale it? How do we mainstream it? And I think that I don't really know if that's necessary. And one of the conversations that I had, like the best part, in a way, I love research more than I love writing. But I was talking to some really old school anarchists before I put pen to paper. And one of them was sort of saying, these things don't necessarily have to last. You know, we often have quite a linear concept of growth, and things must move upwards, but in nature things move in cycles, and when it no longer serves a purpose, it dies. And the lesson that we learned is that that solution was no longer needed. So yeah, I think even just shifting the sort of frameworks with which we use to apply definitions of success or failure, concepts of solutions being addressed at a community level, force us to change that somewhat, I think.
Absolutely. And like, was it a surprise for you when you read that, you know, some of some of these facts, for those who don't know, like Argentina has built a reputation, I suppose, for these worker-run factories, and it doesn't automatically means that these factories, or like these collectives, let's say, that they necessarily agree with other collectives who have the same or similar organizational mode of production, let's say. So was it a surprise for you when you discovered, for example, that some of these groups were actually sympathetic with the government? And I'm sorry, I don't mean to focus necessarily on, I don't have the percentages, but what might be a minority in the wider movement. That's not necessarily the point, but I guess I'm just trying to emphasize a bit, because I've had a number of episodes now on mutual aid, and it's kind of one of the themes of the podcast, I suppose, that like contradictions are there, and contradictions are there, and sometimes, you know, that they might be an obstacle that we need to figure out, and sometimes it's good that contradictions are there. We need to actually think about these things. It's not linear, as you said.
Yeah. And my hunch is, I don't have the statistics either, but I think the movements that do align with the government, if not the movements that align with the government, but movements that are aligned to a political party, far outstretch the number that have no political affiliation at all. I think from memory, and I could be wrong, but the tendency has been, in order for movement to be sustained, some have aligned with political parties, whether it's a governing party or opposition parties, whereas a smaller tranche has been very adamant about autonomy. And I think that question of autonomy is really key with concepts of mutual aid. And I think I have a tendency to be like, resist the state, do it on your own, you know, hold out for as long as you can. But talking to Marina, who's kind of got hands-on experience in these environments, was sort of making the point that it's a lot of what people are looking for, people in urgent need, isn't revolution. it's the old model of gorillas in the hills resisting. That's not really what it's about. It's just
Mm-hmm.
about being able to live from day to day in a
Mm-hmm.
dignified way. So, like ideologies and all the rest of it, it's not as important as just getting done what needs to be done. And I think that's also quite an important lesson for people who, like me, who might want to go off on ideological journeys that probably have very little relevance to reality.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that, so the main argument, I guess, that we made in that episode with the friends from Lebanon on these movements in Lebanon is that if let's say me and him, we also share the kind of an anarchist worldview. If we get too excited about it, let's say, we need to also be super mindful, like extremely cautious, that we're not just trying to have them play out this like this fantasy, I suppose, that like we should be very nuanced, I guess,
Yeah,
what I'm trying to get at, I suppose. And like I think like one of the person you interviewed, Citrine, I believe,
yeah,
she said that, like, she said that of horizontalism, and I'm quoting here, that it's a long process of forging new relationships, sorry, that are the basis of the new society. It is filled with contradictions, and there is still a lot of inequality in Argentina. So like it's not even she, I think, understood that it's not this panacea that necessarily um, covers everything, is going to fix everything. But for those who don't know, and I'm trying to also always be mindful that I'm not just talking to myself, in a sense, like assuming that people understand uh, what we're talking about. How would you define, like, as much as you can, the real differences between mutual aid, a mutual aid collective, a movement, a group of people, whatever, and charity, let's say? Because for many people they can sound like the same thing, but
yeah.
there are some crucial differences. And this is it doesn't to mean that people who work in charity are bad or anything like this. I hope listeners don't get me wrong, but
Hmm.
there are some differences that I feel should be like highlighted, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I think I actually I avoided going into depth in making that distinction in my piece because
Yes.
I wasn't sure if I could articulate it well enough myself. Um, but my understanding is that with mutual aid, there's a stronger element of reciprocity
Yes.
versus the motivations for charity. Um, but then again, there's a difference in mutual aid and barter. It's with mutual aid, it's not like because I've given you, or because we have exchanged, or because I've given you some bread, therefore you must give me a ladder. Like
Yes.
I've understood your need, therefore I'm doing this to meet your need. And that's part of a gesture of building community and the respect that we have for each other. Whereas charity, I guess the roots of charity are quite different. And charity, one could say, is often about tackling the symptoms of a problem rather than actually addressing the problem itself. Um, and yeah, with charity, it often is a lot more sort of top down,
Yeah. Yeah.
outside in direction of travel versus solutions based on a real understanding of need that actually tackle that. It's about, I think mutual aid is more about people working together to solve each other's problems, whereas charity quite often is something that is done to people that are seen as being I don't know, having less agency, perhaps,
Yes. Yes.
I'd say. What
No.
would you say?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. In the conversation we had on Lebanon, um, I actually don't remember if I had mentioned this back then, but the example I had used, or I should have used, is I was sitting with a friend of mine in back home in Lebanon, and we were kind of having this theoretical conversation, essentially, like what is mutual aid, what is it? We're having kind of like a small study group, just me and him. And at some point he just said, like, isn't that what we do with one another, like just me and him?
Mm-hmm.
And it is actually it when so the way I'm trying to frame it, I suppose, or yeah, just trying, it may not succeed necessarily, but most people who are listening to this wouldn't necessarily have participated in mutual aid necessarily, or at least wouldn't think that they have.
Mm-hmm.
And my counter, or my rebuttal in a sense, is that you probably have done this at some level, but you just didn't call it that, and
Right.
you didn't think much of it because it just felt right. It makes sense that if you're close with a friend of yours, or a sibling, or your parent, or your neighbor, what have you, that you know, you won't necessarily think exactly how much that person owes you, or you know, what that person has done for you lately, or shouldn't, you know, the calculations wouldn't necessarily be just like 1 + 1 = 2. It will more be a bit less linear, I suppose. And that's how I've been trying to approach it. It doesn't scale up necessarily, as you said, and it doesn't necessarily have to, but there is a power to it, I think. And you know, maybe I'm wrong, but there's a power to it. And think of it this way, because then if I can make this gesture to my friend, let's say, and I know that my friend would do the same to me, if that is a bond that we can create, that is pretty much outside of capitalism in a sense. It's not defined, like he doesn't owe me anything in that sense.
Mm.
It's not a service being traded, you know, he doesn't financially compensate me for my friendship, and obviously the other way around, neither. That we can kind of scale it up a bit more and think of like this on a community level, and what that would mean. But then the community, of course, exists within a broader society and a country and a global system and everything. And they wouldn't necessarily be able to just quote unquote do it on their own, or that this wouldn't necessarily be the best thing to do either. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I would be very curious if you can walk us through the process, I mean, as much as you can, of course, of like what have you been seeing in the UK, in contrast with the negative coverages, that would actually show that there is this instinct for mutual aid that is actually might be actually more widespread than we think, and is usually just like below the surface, and it kind of needs permission to come out, if you see what I mean, like the state of exception emergencies, like obviously Hurricane Katrina, or during the ongoing pandemic. Have you seen this happening, you know, in London, or maybe in the UK more broadly, or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I mean, I've had like a couple of conversations with people who are running initiatives in East London, but I haven't gone into huge amounts of depth. I think just what struck me was the scale at which these really small, hyper-local, self-organized units were arising to meet local needs. And what was interesting is at the same time this sort of like grassroots movement was booming, the government was reaching out for people to act as volunteers. So whether it was talking to an older person on the phone or picking up medicine, they really wanted people to be able to help to connect, and fulfill gaps that the state itself wasn't able to fill. So while the government was reaching out to people to volunteer, and I think something like 750,000 people did offer to get involved,
Yes.
because of the apparatus, of the speed at which the state is able to move,
Yes.
these 250,000 people were sitting there waiting for something to do, and nothing landed, whereas the local self-led organizations were out delivering food, making sure that school kids who weren't getting meals were getting fed, befriending local people, offering sort of low-level education for people who needed it. So I think I can't really go into the details, but just the energy and the agility of the mutual aid initiatives that emerged versus attempts to solve a similar problem by the state. That contrast really struck me as something that was quite interesting. And I can't speak to the extent that it's been replicated in other countries. Maybe governments in other countries aren't as inept as they are in the UK, but it was quite striking, I think. Another thing that I found interesting, I don't know if it's following on from your question or not,
Mm-hmm.
was from speaking to the women involved with the group in East London,
Mm.
was speaking very much to the issue of autonomy, in the sense that they specifically don't allow anyone who is a serving member of the police
Yes.
or the UK border agency to get involved in any of their initiatives. And the overall mutual aid network, which kind of is a kind of overseeing, I can't even call it a body, but an overseeing space for smaller groups. They specifically warn groups against working with charities, political parties, local governments, and the police, just because things are never absent from the political. And I
Yes.
think um, they're quite keen to make sure that this movement or this outpouring of energy doesn't get co-opted, and that the people who are the most disadvantaged, who quite often might be in borderline states where they might not want to be known to police or might not want to be known to border patrol. That's not even the word. But yeah, they're just quite keen to make sure that people's agency is respected by not blurring those borders between um, people just helping each other and the state having influence and say over what takes place, which is quite different from what is happening or what has happened in Argentina. But I think that question of autonomy is quite a delicate and interesting one, and it's interesting to see how it adapts from location to location and event to event.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I don't know why. Maybe this won't make much sense, but for some reason, when I was thinking of how to formulate my question to you now, and your answer as well, I just thought of I don't know if you know, but like in Hong Kong, they have during the Hong Kong protests, they've had this term like "be water,"
Mm,
and
yeah.
it comes from a Bruce Lee quote, but they
Wow.
he purposed it for obviously for the protest. And I mean, it's kind of what it sounds like in a sense is like just try and adapt to this situation as much as possible. Use the tools at your disposal, and you do have a goal, but don't think that the goal is might so in the context of Hong Kong, the goal is may never be reached, for example,
Hmm.
because the challenge is just so great. But it doesn't mean that we don't think of how to get there, so to speak. So it's more about like the actual process of thinking of how to get to that point than the point itself, because then if you actually reach the point, then obviously there will be the question anyway of like, what do we do now? It's not linear, I suppose, is what we keep on going back on. And um I lost my train of thought a bit,
No,
sorry.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, be water. Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's yeah, and I think tell me, jump in if you have another question, but
Uh-huh.
one of the things that's also been on my mind in the wake of the sort of, I call it an uprising
Hmm.
that's occurred since the killing of George Floyd and a whole lot of other African
Yes,
Americans
yes.
is a lot of I think a lot of it is just about resilience and survival. And I'm quite keen to the direction that I'm kind of going in now is thinking like 100 years ago, communities coming together to find their own solutions, at least where my ancestors come from, which is the Caribbean, like that was
Hmm.
commonplace because there
Hmm.
was no one there to look after your interests. Um, so is it are we just are we focusing on mutual aid because like a Russian guy said it in a book a 100 years ago, or are there are there bountiful ways in which communities have been coming together to meet their own needs outside of the West that are also quite useful for us to look at? And I think for me, and also looking at some of the work that a number of the Black-led organizations in the US are looking at, is that historically there's just so many ways in which communities have come together to address these problems when they know that the state just isn't there, that the idea that we kind of need to be seeing this as a new thing or something that's incredibly academic or um, philosophical doesn't actually fit the reality of the progress of humankind.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. um I've the news, sorry to go back a bit to what you mentioned before, the coverages of the coronavirus responses, I suppose. I think that part of the problem is that, I mean, I don't think that, I think there's data to back it, but like bad news is actually more addictive than good news.
Mm-hmm.
And it also tends to feed into this obsession that we have in sort of having to prove to ourselves that we're not good people, if that makes sense. Like that, to actually prove that if we have too much, basically if push comes to shove, that we actually won't be there for one another, we'll actually be, you know, a dog eat dog situation. And despite the fact that, as we said, like in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and for the, I'm so sorry, as a small parenthesis for the listeners who may not know this, the reason why I'm mentioning Katrina the most is I think it's been the most well documented massive catastrophe of that scale that did not get immediate relief from the state, or at least in recent years, I suppose. And that's why, because Katrina was obviously, for good reasons, blamed on the failures of the U.S. government at the time to do anything about it in the aftermath. So yeah, sorry, it's more parentheses because, as I said, sometimes I feel like I assume that people know what I'm talking about, which isn't fair. In the context of what we're seeing now, the reason why I also go back to Lebanon is I always try and link up as many of these stories as possible, and I see what's happening in the UK, with some having some commonalities with what's happening in the US and what's happening in Lebanon, although it will never be the same. Of course, like Black Lives Matter in the US, for example, won't be necessarily the same as in the UK. There will be commonalities, of course, and we can build on these commonalities, on these similarities. But differences will be there, and that's not a bad thing, of course. Like that, it's important. The African American experience is a very specific experience. The Afro-British experience is a specific experience, and it would be. I mean, obviously, please correct me if I'm wrong, and then let me know if you disagree. But I think it would be kind of a disservice to say that it's just the same thing. And I then bring it back to Lebanon because then it's a very, very different context, or at least at first. But the things that keeps on popping up, of course, is that there are these fundamental needs, these needs of feeling safe, of feeling kinship, feeling some bond with the other, with our friends, family, neighbors, what have you. And that mutual aid is one framework. It doesn't have to be the only framework, but it's one framework that I feel if we manage to scale it up just a bit more, it doesn't have to be at the nation states level, if that's even possible, but just trying to replicate it as much as possible in as many different contexts as possible, while accepting contradictions and trying to understand all of these obstacles that will come with all of this, as you know, some of the things that you yourself have mentioned, that this is actually, you know, it's part of the story. It's not linear, as we keep on going back on. But you end the piece, I think it was the first piece, I actually don't remember, but you ended with this paragraph, questions such as how can this be sustained or delivered at scale, which I suppose we've tried to answer here as well, can be arrived at in due course, but might be the wrong starting point, which it's an excellent sentence, by the way. To make space for these questions, we will organize, and then you mentioned some of the things that you, I think you mentioned that you and the correspondent might do in the near future. So let me ask you, like, what's next on that front? What are some of these things that you might want to explore further in the in the future? And what do you feel like exploring next, in a sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the piece that I wrote after the mutual aid one was looking at education, and sort of, I guess we're kind of in a phase where a lot is up in the air, and what it looks like when it lands, it felt for some time as if we had some scope to kind of decide what we actually wanted. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But yeah, the issue of schools being closed and parents having to educate their children, and questions about the purpose of education, being part of the common debate, was something that I wanted to look at. I mean, even with something like education, the concept of what does it look like for a community to educate a child? How is that possible when parents need to work? And even within that, the whole concept of community, people being able to play different roles, sharing knowledge, sharing information, that's something that came up as a solution. So is education mutual aid, probably I wouldn't put it under that banner, but it's that questions of how progress can benefit from more cooperation and collaboration at a lower scale, I find quite fascinating. So that was that one. The one I'm currently writing on is looking at grief and collective responses to grief, and the role of community ritual within that, which is something that has sort of fallen from part of the Western tradition. So looking at ways in which that's being resurrected in digital spaces, and drawing on traditions from pre-colonial eras in non-Western countries is also proving quite interesting. One that probably will speak more closely to mutual aid is the issue of food and food justice.
Yes.
The ways in which people are being fed at the moment is something that mutual aid initiatives seem to be speaking to quite directly. And I think also in New Orleans, sorry, the name slipped my mind for a moment. In New Orleans, one of the things that has sustained since Katrina are food-based mutual aid initiatives, just because so many of the communities are still classified as food deserts, like there's no access to decent food and nutrition. So yeah, the issue of community and food and the need to eat is massively important. And in a way, if I can do a little plug for a book, people are rightly talking about Kropotkin's work, Mutual Aid, but he also has another collection of essays entitled The Conquest of Bread.
Yes.
Have you read it?
Yeah, I have.
It's great, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that the sort of, I mean, it's not the central theme, but a recurring point is in terms of the right to well-being, the ability to feed oneself. That's essential, and without that, any progress is quite limited. So yeah, looking at food is definitely on the agenda. But to be honest, everything is moving so fast. I'm kind of having to be quite responsive. So I think I can envisage 2 at a time. And then I'll see what comes next.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I think that's fair enough. On a final note on my part, one of the things that I've also been trying to get at is how to make the case, I suppose, for mutual aid as something that as a tool, right, rather than necessarily as a final goal, because that can, I mean, it might be, but that's a different conversation and discussion. And there is this concept in economics. I mean, it's a recent one called like donut economics.
Yeah.
And the reason why I like it is that it is proposing that we find ways to have safety nets and to have upper limits. So the safety nets are mainly social. So education, housing, security, food security, et cetera, community, I think is actually one of them, and so on and so forth. Just trying to have a ground essentially for people to stand on, and the upper limits tend to be planetary. So like obviously climate change, food security would fall into that, I suppose, as well, and a bunch of other stuff. People, if listeners listening to this, you can just Google like donut economics, and I think there's a number of models. And it's not the same thing. Donut economics can be applied in different contexts, and there will even be people who will argue that we might get the basics, but then the rest of it within the donut we can still apply capitalism, for example. And so that's a conversation, I suppose, for a different time. I would probably disagree with that, but again, different time. Are there any first, sorry, I would say, like, do you have any final thoughts, and where can people follow your work if they want to? And
Final thoughts. No, I entirely agree. And it is challenging to. I mean, I guess the case of Argentina perhaps proves differently, which is good. It's always good to have a range of options to look to. But I do think for me at least, it's challenging to have conversations about mutual aid and ways in which movements like it can be sustained without deeply questioning, if not calling for, the end of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's, I think, avoiding having that conversation, which is often quite triggering for many people, and sticking to using mutual aid as a tool, I think it definitely has huge amounts of value
Yes.
to fixing some of the urgent issues that we're facing. I also think, as well as being pragmatic, like it really is an interesting time to explore old ideas
Yeah.
and understanding how they can be adapted to where we are now. One of the books I'm loving at the moment is called Anarchy in Action, um,
Mm.
and it's by a British anarchist writer that basically just looks at practical anarchy. What does it mean outside of concepts, outside of theories? What does it look like in terms of how you design a playground? What does it look like in terms of the role of women? What does it look like in terms of self-employment? And it was written in the she was written in the 60s and then republished in the 80s, but so much of it really feels relevant to now. Um, and yeah, I just think approaching things with an open mind, being solutions focused, is a really strong antidote to the fear and terror and apathy, which I sometimes go through on an hourly basis. But yeah, it's kind of just remembering that we are decent people, that we always have been decent people, is quite useful in terms of how we move through the uncertainty, which is both a challenge and an opportunity at the moment, I think.
Absolutely. That's an excellent note to end on. Thank you a lot for your time. This has been a really nice chat.
No problem. I hope it made sense.
It did. It did. Thank you.